But I did want to start by getting your reactions to the events, the tragic events in Sri Lanka, which is, of course, a member country of the AIIB.
I'm extremely saddened by the tragedy, and I like to give my condolences to the families of the victims and to the government, my sympathy. Sri Lanka is a member in good standing, and we have been doing a lot with the government. Recently, we approved 2 projects for Sri Lanka. One is the housing, which could be benefiting a lot of low-income families, and the other is this landslide prevention, which is very much important for some people in the fragile areas. So I'm very much sorry about this strategy, and I'm certainly worried about the impact on the fragile economy. We will do our best to help them.
Well, I just wanted to follow up briefly on that. I mean, we have to be very careful about talking about the economic impact so soon after an event like this, but it is obviously something that is being considered, and we heard leaders in Sri Lanka there talking about potential outflows. How damaging do you think could be for Sri Lanka's economy?
Well, I certainly hope the government could take control of the overall situation with the support of international community and the multilateral development banks. We can help the Sri Lanka government and the people.
Let's shift focus to the AIIB now. And just for the context for our viewers, I think it's worth reminding that the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was set up with China, of course, in the lead, proved controversial at the beginning, but is now seen by the vast majority of those who look at it as being an institution that does uphold standards, international standards. In terms of the membership, and of course, there was all the controversy at the start about the US not joining, but others like the UK getting on board very quickly. Where does membership stand at this moment? How much enthusiasm are you seeing for joining the bank?
Growing from 57 founding members, we have now 97. And, the membership increase indicates that the international community has trust in this institution. They come to believe that the AIIB is operated by high international standards. And they are certainly impressed with the governance, transparency, and our attention to social and environmental issues. So I'm very much confident with our continued efforts to run this bank by a very high standards, we can do a great job and make a lot of difference in the economic development of developing member countries.
Mr. Jin, it's Yvonne in Hong Kong. I'm very glad that you could join us on the program. I just want to ask about a lot of questions that the international community has raised about China's global ambitions in the Belt and Road Initiative here. We've seen countries like Malaysia, the Maldives pull back from projects due to the amount of debt issues. How do you address some of these issues here? What do you tell countries now about how this could potentially, or is not, actually a debt trap?
I don't think it's appropriate for me to speak on behalf of the Chinese government. I'm no longer in the Chinese government, so I can only say something as an international civil servant. You see, in my view, the Belt Road Initiative proposed by the Chinese government is good. It is intended to improve the connectivity and to promote regional and global cooperation. If it's implemented very well, I think it would be very much contributing to the economies of all those countries involved. Indeed, in spite of the questions and misgivings or the doubts of some of the people, in some of the countries, indeed, a lot of the government officials of developing countries which I met expressed a great interest in supporting and participating in the Belt Road Initiative. So I think if we can follow President Xi's very important principle, broad consultation and dialogue, joint contribution, and shared benefit, I think it will be done very well. So the issue is not whether the Belt Road Initiative is a geopolitical motivation of the Chinese government. The issue is the implementation of this program by all of the participating countries in the interest of the broad members of the international community. That is the key. With regard to debt sustainability, I certainly think it's an important issue. For some of this country, it's a challenge. But I don't think we should stop the construction of basic infrastructure projects. I think it's a matter of how you balance the budget? How do you balance the balance of payments against the need for the continued investment in infrastructure in many countries? You referred to Malaysia. To my knowledge, the Malaysian government is interested in working with China to develop some of the projects which were put on hold right after the Prime Minister was back in power. So I think it's very good. It's this kind of dialogue is helpful.
Mr. Jin, this is David. I'm right beside Yvonne here in Hong Kong. Just as a follow-up to that then, in terms of, we can get into a very lengthy conversation in terms of, our countries. Is this more a political alignment with China versus, I guess, overlooking maybe some terms of some of the debt agreements? And we can save that for another day. I guess my question for you is, the health of these economies where a lot of the debt is being built up, and there's no question that those countries do need infrastructure investment, the health of those economies is cyclical. In other words, sometimes they're healthy, sometimes they're not. Is there a fair amount of flexibility built into those terms of agreement in order to address some of those concerns that the debt is not sustainable?
I do believe debt sustainability is an important issue for some of these countries. But you should understand that borrowing from international capital market, borrowing from the multilateral institutions is the cause for debt sustainability problems. For instance, given my country's experience, starting from 1980, China invested massively in infrastructure with much of the money borrowed from the outside, including the resources from the World Bank and later on AIIB. But China never, ever had to suffer from the debt problems. It's important to keep in mind, what matters is not whether you should borrow or not. It's to invest wisely, judiciously, the resources available to you. Now, so given the bottlenecks of infrastructure, which drags down the growth of so many countries in the developing world, should we stop investing in infrastructure? That can only make the matter worse. So in my view, the infrastructure investment should continue to the extent possible. At the same time, the government should keep the proper balance between the budget, the balance of payments, and the resources available to them from the international market. So we take this very seriously. In my view, if the infrastructure project is done properly and completed on schedule, it should be able to generate revenues of these countries as soon as possible. I think what is important is to keep all this infrastructure investment free from corruption and take care of the environmental issues and have these projects done in a way which the local people would be benefited from that. So I think it's the approach to development, it's approach to infrastructure development, rather than the very simplistic issue whether you should borrow or not.
I just want to switch focus to the trade conversations, because it does seem like we're in the last stages now of these trade talks, and there's optimism on both sides. How significant, just not speaking necessarily as president of the AIIB, but in your own personal capacity, how significant do you think this deal could end up being?
As an economist, I do believe an amicable resolution of the trade disputes between the United States and China is beneficial not just to these two major countries, but also to the rest of the world. And you can see the sincerity and a commitment on both sides over the last couple of months, and I certainly hope they will come to conclusion without further delay.
Do you think it leads to a truce, or does it lead to a resetting of relations?
I think the two governments are aiming at a solution, not just the truce. Truce is not something I think we are looking forward to, because you have some moments of tranquility and then the disputes breaks out again. That's not very good. And also, truce leaves the market in uncertainty. The investors will be very much worried about what comes next. So I would like to see there would be a solution, and U.S. and China would go back on the right track. You see, these two countries enjoyed such great cooperation, economically or otherwise, over the last 4 decades. And I was involved in a U.S.-China economic dialogue. ever since early 1980s. And we see the benefit accruing to the Chinese and American people. So truce is definitely not a solution. I don't think it's a solution.
And you were there and you were involved in the discussions when there was a lot of reform happening here in China. Yes. Does this trade deal potentially act as a catalyst to spur deeper reforms that will benefit the private sector?
I do believe, first of all, the Chinese government has the urge and commitment to continue the reforms. It's not something which is imposed on them. On the other hand, resolving the trade disputes certainly would be very much conducive to the next round of the reforms to be undertaken by the Chinese government.
I just wanted to get your views on the economy as well. Again, with your hat as an economist and a former Vice Minister of Finance, how far do we think we are? Have we reached the bottom in terms of the slowdown here in China? Are there additional measures, priorities that the government here should be taking?
I think the Chinese economy is doing fine, and it's expected to achieve the growth rate probably above 6% or so. But you see, I often said the Chinese economy 3-4 decades ago is not the same as what we have today. So 6% growth rate is not the same thing as 8%, 9%, which achieved 10 or 20 years ago. So I think it's very good indeed for China to continue to achieve growth around 6%. Now, with regard to the economic policies pursued by the Chinese government, I think all these measures would be very good for the long-term growth of the Chinese economy. For instance, to lower the entry barrier for the private sector is important, creating jobs and keeping the momentum of the growth of the economy. And the Chinese monetary policy is supportive but not inundating. It's not flooding, as the Chinese government said. We are not going to have this across-the-board stimulus package. I think it's precision, it's well-targeted growth measures.